I have many memories of David Hartman. It's even weird to talk about them as memories as opposed to just sort of what I know of him as an acquaintance. But one of them was how every once in a while, whenever I happened to be in the same synagogue as him, when we would be reading the Torah parsha, the Torah portion, and he would spend half the time talking to other people during the Torah reading. And it wasn't your regular schmoozing or gossip. It usually was that he was outraged by the fact that the Torah said something. And so if you would go to synagogue, the Shabbat where we read the Akedah, he would be halfway through, he'd be to the person sitting there like, why are we reading this? What's going on? Right? Or halfway through something like we just read last week's Torah portion was about how men are worth 50, but women are worth 30, and so on. And he would, he probably would have gone on a tirade to the person next to him about how can we still be reading this and so on. And yet, of course, if we would not read that, that would also, create a different kind of tirade. And I was always amazed by his ability to read a text as if he had never read it before. To realize that if we're reading this, we must mean it. And therefore, we have to ask even the most essential questions, where most of us are willing to say, oh, of course, now we're reading this, now we're doing this, and just accept life by rote. There's an aspect of David that he was always able to not accept life by rote, but actually to always constantly ask anew, why are we doing this? What are we doing when we're doing this? He would, towards the end of his life, which is more the time that I studied with him, he would sometimes say, I remember on his 80th birthday, he sort of said, I'm 80 years old and I don't know what I want to do when I grow up. And that's a stance both that he took towards life, but it's also a stance he took towards text. That whenever encountering it, it was always as encountering it totally anew. And in that way, he really lived one of the most moving midrashim that I think of, which says, every day they should seem to you as totally new. And if we believe in a God who created the world, whatever that means, and creates it anew every day, that every day God recreates the works of creation, that requires us to look at things anew. Now, sometimes that can drive a person crazy, to look at everything anew every day. And there were times when it drove David crazy, I think, or the people around him, definitely. But there was also that amazing freshness that he brought to every encounter, to every text. And I sort of hope to bring some of that freshness to us, because what we're going to be doing today is asking, what does it mean to be learning Torah in the modern world? We can't just be learning the way we learned 2,000 years ago, and we definitely can't be learning the way we did 100 years ago. We have to be learning differently. And there were, I would say, three things that David Hartman put on the table, which in many ways, I don't want to say no one else did, because many other people did, but that he did in a very unique way and in a powerful way. The first one was, in many ways, he was fighting a war against Freud and Nietzsche. Not because he disagreed with them, but because he agreed with so much of what they had to say, that on one aspect he couldn't agree with. Freud and Nietzsche, and before them Spinoza and others, see religion as the place where a person sort of lowers their spine, lowers their head, and accepts a yoke of obedience, an external authority which you need to accept. And David Hartman wanted to say it is possible to be a Jew or a religious person in the modern world and not do that through a stance of sort of lowering your head, but through a very tall stance, through standing upright. And in fact, that religion and the encounter with God and the encounter with tradition is one that makes you stand upright and not hang your head low in obedience. Now, he had a hard time pushing that agenda forward, because in many ways I think the second half of the 20th century was a lot of people actually saying, you know what, the modern world exhausts me. I don't want to be holding my head up so much. I'd rather lower my head and someone else can make decisions for me. And I think we see that playing out in the world in many, many ways. David Hartman fought to make a Judaism where you were holding your head up, and tradition was actually calling upon you to hold your head up. At the same time, I think he also very much, let's put it this way, I think he pulled the rug from under his own feet. Because where many other Jewish modern teachers would say, oh, the world has all these things to say, but we Jews, we're unique. Or, there are many traditions out there, but we Jews, we have it right. We are an Am Sgula, which means we are unique people that no one has what we have. He denied his own ability to say that. He would describe that often one of his most important seminal theological experiences is playing basketball in the Bronx, where he would discover that, you know what? Jews are pretty good, but so are African Americans, and so are Protestants, and so are Catholics. And they seem to have something pretty good to say about the world as well. And you know what? You can actually be a secular humanist and be a totally moral person. Now, once he said that, and that sort of accepts the sort of basis of his pluralism, you can no longer say, we Jews are unique and we are the only path to truth. So from the basketball court, in some ways, David was able to say, I think, the most profound and revolutionary statement, which is, Sinai was great, but it wasn't the only great thing ever. And I don't need Sinai to be the only thing for it to be the only thing for me. Now that tension is one that I think he spent the rest of his life and the communities around him continue to bridge. What does it mean to say Sinai had infinite meaning, but it's not the only place that has infinite meaning? Other places, there are other Sinais out there for other people that might be meaningful, and I'm not fighting against them. And yet I think that for me, and maybe for my community, Sinai is the way to go. So how he bridged those two is I think, part of the questions we're going to ask today. And I wanted to start with a short text where he describes a little bit of what learning could be. And this is from one of his, really from his first book, which is called Joy and Responsibility. And in this article, he talks about how many people experience religion as a place that is devoid of joy, of actually how religion is, you have to submit your own joy and your own sort of hedonism for a greater authority or for a greater truth than your own satisfaction. And his discussion, and this was written in the 70s, was to say that no, actually Judaism values joy enormously. And he speaks about 3 different kinds of joys, and we're only going to look at one of them, but just to give you a sense, he speaks about joy as adequacy, joy as a sense of something greater than yourself, and joy as mastery. And those 3 are 3 different aspects of, just what makes us not just happy, but a true deep joyfulness. If you think for a second about yourself and those own places that you would say, I'm not just happy, but I experience deep joy. We often experience that through our children. Seeing our children do well and thrive in the world gives us a sense of deep joy. And David, or sort of based on philosophers talking about what joy is, would say that's about joy, the joy of feeling connected to something bigger than myself, that kind of joy of expansiveness. I'm connected to a project that is bigger than just my own mortal self. There's also the joy of doing a full act, a complete act. Now, if the joy of putting together Legos, the joy of finishing something at work and submitting it, right? The joy of pulling off something successful, or for me, it's the joy of baking a cake. There's a sense of mastery that you feel. Why is that so joyful for us? Because there's a sense of being able to perform a complete action and a mastery. And there's a third kind of joy, he says, and that's the joy that you feel. It's the joy of adequacy and dignity. I have self-worth. I am a person in this world. I am adequate. We spend so much of our lives feeling inadequate in different ways and then making other people feel inadequate in their own ways. But there's a deep joy when we feel a sense of adequacy. It's that third joy that we're going to read about here, about how he sees that joy of adequacy in learning Torah. And as we read this portion, I want you to sort of contrast this in your mind, either from your own experience or from what you know. I would say that for many people, when they describe what learning in cheder or learning in yeshiva is about how really knowing, about how learning Torah is constantly a sense of inadequacy. That many sort of traditional realms of study is the sense of inadequacy. And this is true in academia. It's true in many professional worlds. The sense of inadequacy. You don't know. We know. Right? You're an associate here at our law firm. We know how to be lawyers. We've been doing this for a long time. You just shut up and listen to what we have to say. Or at the yeshiva, or at the surgeon's hall, or in various places where the sense is people learn through a sense of inadequacy. Here he's going to discuss how learning Torah is a process of adequacy.
The tradition of learning reflects a deep sense of human adequacy and an acknowledgement of the dignity of man. Within the Jewish tradition, the importance of learning is closely related to the model of God as the accepting, loving teacher. The student who feels the warmth and the love of his teacher is encouraged to work out the implications of what his teacher has given him. The teacher's love liberates the student to create, yet to regard his creation as an expansion of what he received. This experience underlies such Talmudic statements as everything that an accomplished student shall say before his teacher was given by Moses at Sinai, or the following beautiful story. Rav Judah said in the name of Rav, "When Moses ascended on high, he found the Holy One, blessed be he, engaged in affixing coronets to the letters. Said Moses, Lord of the universe, who stays thy hand? He answered, There will arise a man at the end of many generations, Akiva ben Yosef by name, who will expound upon each tittle heaps and heaps of laws. Lord of the universe, said Moses, permit me to see him. He replied, Turn thee round. Moses went and sat down behind 8 rows and listened to the discourses upon the law. Not being able to follow their arguments, he was ill at ease, but when they came to a certain subject, and the disciples said to the masters, Whence do you know it? And the latter replied, It is a law given unto Moses at Sinai. He was comforted. Thereupon he returned to the Holy One, blessed be he, and said, Lord of the universe, thou hast such a man, and thou givest the Torah by me. He replied, Be silent, for such is my decree. Although it is correct to say that the halacha derives from Moses, it is Akiva, the student of Moses, who continues the tradition and creates within the framework of the teachings received from Moses. The secure student is not paralyzed by the authoritative words of his teacher. He recognizes in them multiple possibilities and is prepared to expand on them. Moreover, just as in human relationships of intense love, one often feels that all one is or has is due to the other. So too the student who is intensely committed to the words of his teacher often does not distinguish between what he has created and what he has received. It is important to differentiate between creativity grounded in love, which flows from an intense relationship, and the creativity of one who is conscious of separation and of individuality. Midrashic writers reflect the relationship of a lover to a beloved. The feeling that the Torah is a gift of love from God permeates all their writings. Because the Torah was given in love and studied with love, it contains all that future generations will discover to be included in God's message.
Go a little bit further.
Okay. With the development of the oral tradition, Israel becomes a co-partner in the creative process of the word. Revelation ceases to be a word given once and for all at Sinai, but becomes a word that is continuously discussed and developed by students. The word which mediates divine love becomes integrated with the human response. The creative development of the Torah by the student and the teacher's guidance become part of one Torah. The oral Torah and the written Torah become one.
So I'm curious, what strikes you within this text? What's going on? He's both quoting this potent story about Moses and Rabbi Akiva. Maybe it's not so clear what's going on there, but he turns it into something very different, I think, than what the text is just saying initially.
So, there's a traditionalist viewpoint that the further we are from the epicenter of Sinai, the less we know, the less authoritative we are. And the way he takes the story of Moshe and Rabbi Akiva's academy is that the further you are from the epicenter, the more insight you have, because each student adds to what he or she received from the teacher.
Great. And what allows the fact that I'm so distant from tradition and yet this is actually better? What allows David Hartman here to flip the usual order that the closer you are to Sinai, the better you are, that he says, here, look, Talmudic tradition is teaching us actually, in some ways, the more distant I am, perhaps the greater I can achieve a relationship to God.
I don't know what it is that makes David Hartman think of it, but to the extent that Sinai is tradition is like a foundational document of what our law is supposed to be, if we bring our own lives into this, we have a constitution in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
It's a foundational document. At the time it was written, African Americans were 3/5 of the people. It's only as we progress as a civilization and with life experiences that we can reinterpret these things and see the inequity and injustice in that and reinterpret what it is that was written to say that in fact they're entitled to human rights, and we can do the same thing as we do.
So you did two important things here. One is you analogized it to, I think, one of the greatest analogies that we have, right, which is to the American Constitution and how we work to interpret it, and the fact that in this country today, I know there are a few lawyers sitting around here, so I'll tread delicately. But there's an enormous debate around what does it mean to interpret the Constitution? Are we allowed to? And what do we bring into that in a way that actually mimics Talmudic thought very much? And already Robert Cover wrote a lot about what the American judicial system can learn from the Talmudic conversation around this. But what I heard in the second piece is you're saying, well, now that we've progressed so much, now that we have such perhaps a clearer view of what life and liberty is, we can now interpret this perhaps even better than the original text had meant. And that's a good liberal argument. And interestingly, it's not what David Hartman is saying here, which I think is what's so interesting about it, and what would make, say, David Hartman's reading of this text different from what, say, Eugene Borowitz of the Reform movement would read in this text. He's not saying we're better because now we're older, we're more mature, and we know more, or humans have progressed. He's actually saying something a little different. I'm curious, just one more voice. What do you see here? What strikes you from this text? What surprised you?
I would say that each student is expanding, and the teacher's love liberates that student to expand further on, and that would seem to me to apply geometrically. So by the time of Rabbi Akiva, there's already been a further development in the Torah itself of what things mean, rather than from outside sources.
Now, I think the key here is what allows that sort of geometric expansion is in a theological point that Hartman is making here, and that is that God is a teacher, and that we perceive God, first of all, as a teacher. Now, that's different from God, say, as a magistrate, as a judge who gives out rulings, or God as a father who disciplines, or God as a mother who cares in those stereotypes of sort of mother and father. Here, it's God as teacher. And every morning, if you wake up and say the blessings of the Torah, you're actually one of the first blessings we say when we wake up in the traditional unending rituals of Judaism is Hamelamed Torah, Baruch Atah Hashem, Hamelamed Torah le'amo Yisrael. Blessed are you, God, for you are the God who teaches Torah to the people Israel. God is a teacher. He's not just a speaker of divine word. He is not just the source of prophecy or the source of truth. God is, first of all, a teacher. And one of the basic truths of the teacher is the relationship between the teacher and the student. In many ways, the teacher wouldn't exist if he didn't have students. There's no such thing as a teacher who doesn't have students. Hasidic thought, which was distant to a certain extent from David Hartman's thinking, said this differently. It said, "En melech belo am." There's no king without a people, which is to say, so to speak, if there was no people, God would not be king. So in the same way, if there is no student, God is not a teacher, or rather, God is not God at all. So the teacher needs the student. More than that, the teacher loves the student. There's a relationship of love. And when love exists, then the expansion that the student makes towards of the teacher's teaching is seen by the teacher and by the student as an expansion of the teacher's teaching himself. In this way, it's the big difference between sort of the academic approach to learning and, I would say, the yeshiva approach to learning. The academic approach to learning is, if I said something and I discover that someone said it before me, that's the greatest tragedy, because I can no longer publish it as my own statement. My wife had that. She's a scientist. She was about to publish a paper in Nature, which is the most important science magazine. Literally 2 days before her, a different group submitted a similar article. They were neck to neck, and they finished first, so she couldn't publish that article. Luckily, she published a different article in Science. It was just as good. She got a job. There's a happy ending there. In the yeshiva world, it's actually the exact opposite. If I say something and then I discover that someone has already said that, that's the biggest compliment there is. Because that means that what I'm saying is right. And in fact, right, I'm in good company, and I can actually attribute it both to myself and to greater people. God, in David Hartman's reading here, is not the academic who says, I need either, you have to attribute very clearly who said this first and where is this coming from, but rather, through the relationship of a teacher and a student, ideas continue to grow in a way that can totally be connected to what the teacher initially said. So there's an aspect of the creativity that is allowed here between the teacher and the student. Now, so there's a theological basis here to this, of God as the teacher, God as basically a teacher. And there's also, in that way, David Hartman is able to kind of leap over the biggest tension, to a large extent, of modern Jewish thought, which is whose authority are we working on? Autonomy versus heteronomy, right? Kant sort of plays out these two ideas of either you're an enlightened human being and you're working on your own autonomy, or you're bowing your head to someone else's authority, in which case it's heteronomy, right? It's an external source of authority. That question falls in this text because a teacher and a student who love each other and continue, the student who continues the teacher's work, it's no longer a question of, wait, was that your idea or your teacher's idea, right? Wait, are you saying this or are you just saying this because that's what they taught you in school? When there's a true relationship between teachers and students, the question of authority and heteronomy, autonomy and heteronomy sort of falls to the wayside. Because the teacher sees his goal in empowering the student, and because the student sees his goal in continuing what the teacher's life work is. In that way, not only is this a way of sort of circumventing one of the biggest problems, I think, of modern Jewish thought, or of modern philosophy and psychology in a way, but more than that, I think that what Hartman does here is he connects it back to the question of joy. Because one of the things that students are supposed to receive from their teachers is that sense of adequacy. Being invited to the table to teach, being invited by the teacher to be empowered to teach what the teacher has said itself, that is the biggest sense of adequacy. Around the table of the Beit Midrash, you're not the least important person here just there to suck in what the teacher has said and then repeat it, but rather you're invited with your entire self and all of your creativity to both really internalize what the teacher has said, and yet also to take it and be totally creative with it and turn it into your own. That's the place of adequacy, and that's the place of joy. And in that regard, I think there are a few places where this plays out in a very real way. If you'll notice, when we talk about Torah scholars, or what great Jewish scholars look like, the term in Hebrew, the term currently, if you ask in the ultra-Orthodox community, they'll talk about gedolim, great people, right? Or they'll talk about chachamim, sages. But the term the rabbis use in the Talmud is never just chachamim. What is it? Talmidei chachamim, the students of wise people. And you might think, well, why would I want to describe myself as a student of a wise person? I am a wise person myself. Can I never break out of being someone else's student? And yet, being a Talmid Chacham is exactly about the kind of relationship you have to knowledge, to divine truth, to divine message. I am a Talmid Chacham, and we are all Talmidei Chachamim, which means that I am both continuing my teacher's path, and I'm also empowered to create my own path within that. And I never even ask the question of, wait, did I say this? Or did my teacher say this? The fact that question is sort of brushed aside because of the importance of the relationship is I think, one of the greatest moves of trying to bring a yeshiva mentality, a Talmid Chacham mentality, into the modern world. I want to show you that this is also grounded not only in theory, but also in doing. So in the Hartman Beit Midrash, from its earliest days before I was born to the days where I was a member of the Beit Midrash, the way we learned was not just through lectures. And many of you experience this, but rather there would be a topic and the students would teach. There would be a round robin where the students would teach. Each time a different chavruta would present. And at the end of the day, if it was David or someone else who was sort of the greatest Talmid Chacham in the room, would respond. Now, don't think that David Hartman, if you met him, he would never say, oh, that was so sweet, what you said, it was great, you're wonderful. That's the way, I talk to my daughter when she, writes full of spelling mistakes. I just applaud, right? David would pillage. He would criticize. He would attack. But he would do it in a way that is full of love and the sense of adequacy that he gave to his students. Because I know you can do this, I actually demand so much more. If I would leave you with one thing from this class, I would say that whenever we would read a text, and I've heard this both from David and from his students, he would always ask, what's the question the text is really asking? What's this text really asking? Here we have a story about Moses and Rabbi Akiva. What's the text really asking? And you could say, I think the text is really asking, what's the place of authority in the world? Or how will we be remembered? The question of immortality, right? There are different ways. And the question he would ask, what is the text asking? It would always be a philosophical question. It would always be a greater psychological question. It would never be a small question. So even even what seems to be the most minute question, as sort of, if you had a mikveh full of snow, could you purify yourself in a mikveh full of snow? He would say, well, there's a deeper philosophical question there to be asked. It might be about can things really change in the world? In other words, when water changes into ice, or it might be about the nature of human suffering. If you need to purify yourself and yet you're going to freeze to death, then no, it's not going to work, right? But there's always a deeper question under it. What's the text really asking? And in a way, what David Hartman is saying is the truly joyful learning and the learning of Rabbi Akiva and Moshe here is exactly not one of individuality and separation, which doesn't mean that Rabbi Akiva can't innovate. And yet when he innovates and he's asked, where do you know this from? What does he say? He says it's from Moses. And that's not conniving. That's not trickery, right? But rather it's through a deep connection in this relationship, right? It's the difference between, I think, being a chacham and being a talmid chacham, right? And how you frame the project for yourself. Now, we'll never know the answer to the question, when the rabbis were innovating, how aware were they of the innovation and how unaware were they? Were they experiencing through, I really know that I'm so different, right? And yet I'm going to claim that it's theirs. And there's a term for that in Talmudic thought. It's called hanging yourself on a tall tree. Not hanging like this, right? But connecting yourself to a tall tree. That's a good thing sometimes. But there's the difference between that and actually thinking of yourself really as a branching out of that tree, in a way. So I think it's very interesting actually to think about when we're reading through David Hartman's writings. When is he pushing back against authoritarianism, which he does a lot, and against traditionalism? And when is he also pushing back against individualism, or over-individualism, what he would see, and separation? And here's a place where you can actually see him sort of subtly pushing back. And again, I think that's why he would constantly go back to metaphors of relationships that involve love. Because it's exactly when you'll have to excuse me, I've been reading a lot of criticisms of modern discussions of love and how in many ways modernity and the modern project through, say, Immanuel Kant, lost love in favor of rationalism. Or even you take the way we talk about ethics today, right? We want to find an ethics that is completely devoid of a question of love. It's only about what is the right thing to do universally for everyone. Yet, what's the place for love in that, right? What's the place for love we want to be able to think about relationships and about the ethical in rational terms, but we also recognize that the biggest driving force in our lives is love, not rationality. And I think that's why he pushes towards constantly the metaphors of teacher and student, which are relationships of love, and parents and children, which are relationships of love. So God is a teacher and God is a parent. And those are two relationships where the sense of individuality and separation are totally undermined, because you're constantly bridging over them through this weird thing which we call love. So I don't know if I think your challenge still stands in a way, but I think that's exactly what he's trying to work around in a way. What are other models if not the teacher-student? Right. So the other classic model is the prophet. What does the prophet do? The prophet channels the word of God, preferably as closely correlated as possible to the original word of God. That's Maimonides' big distinction. Moses was the greatest prophet because he was able to channel the word of God totally objectively, right? And other prophets also inserted their own subjectivity into it in a way. So the prophet is the place where we are channeling the word of God, and creativity is not a place here. And there's, I guess, a strong sense of separation within that, right? I'm channeling the word of God and then giving it to other people. Love doesn't play as much of a role. Heschel would be rolling in his grave to hear me say this, but love is not the most important thing here, but rather it's the transmission of the word of God. And creativity for the prophet is deeply disturbing. I don't want the prophet to be overly creative. I want him to be controlling his imagination, controlling his creative sense in order to give me the word of God. The sage, the miracle man, which is what we're going to talk about in a second, is also about that, sort of just channeling the actual word of God. That's very different from the teacher and the student. If I'm hearing the truth from an oracle or from a prophet, there's no place for creativity. If I'm listening to the truth from a teacher, then there's a relationship, there's a give and take. And that's exactly why the creativity is so built into it. So with those thoughts, I want to back up and go into a different story. So I want us to spend the next half an hour looking at this story. It's called the Oven of Aknai, and you might have studied it before. It's the story famously where Rabbi Yehoshua stands up in the middle of the Beit Midrash and says, it's not in heaven. Right? The Torah is not in heaven. The story is usually studied only the first half of the story. And we're going to talk about the first half of the story, but what I'm really interested in is the second half of the story, because it inserts into this sort of theological conversation a lot of human relationships. But I want to just charge our reading of the story for a second here. So we've spoken a little bit about what does it mean to be a religious person in the modern world. And we've spoken about how, on the one hand, there's this tension between autonomy and heteronomy, and how many people view religion as heteronomy, as bowing your head for the will of God. And how, on the other hand, other people say, no, we can only have a place of autonomy. In that discussion, perhaps the best biblical story is the story of the Akedah, right? Where Abraham is asked to, as Kierkegaard would read it, or as Soloveitchik or Leibowitz would read it, or many modern readers would read it, Abraham is asked to sacrifice not only his son, but to sacrifice his morality for the word of God, right? It's the absolute place of heteronomy. You have to sacrifice what you believe in order to serve God most fully. And for many religious people today, the Akedah continues to be the most informative narrative. For David Hartman, there was a different narrative, which he would constantly repeat again and again and again. And that is not the Akedah, it's the other Abraham story, the story of Sodom, where God says, I have an obligation to inform Abraham of what I'm doing. God is inviting Abraham into the conversation. And when he does and tells Abraham that he's planning on destroying Sodom, Abraham calls him out on it and demands of him, how could you do this? What if there are 50 righteous people? What if there are 40? What if there are 30? And God and Abraham get into this give and take. Now, we could spend a lot of time talking about how do you live, both narratives, both the Akedah and Sodom, both the place where human beings are asked to relinquish their own autonomy, or to totally enact it in the face of God. But I'm sharing that story also to say that part of the way we understand ourselves and understand our roles within communities is through the stories that we tell. That's how we sort of explain to ourselves if we're doing well or not, what we should be doing in different places. In many ways, I think, in the 20th century, suddenly this story, the story of the Oven of Aknai, became one of the most important stories to be retelling to ourselves again and again and again. And different people derive different meanings from this story. One of the great Jewish Talmudists alive today, Daniel Boyarin, who is a radical thinker in all kinds of ways and kind of reinvents himself every book he writes. In every book he quotes this story, the Oven of Aknai, and in every one he totally reads the story differently from the way he read it in the previous book. And I would say for many years of studying at the Hartman Institute, at some point we were like disgusted with the story already. Like, enough already. How many more times can we read this story? And yet what I want to do is sort of challenge us with those fresh eyes of David Hartman to reread this story and see what's really going on here. So in that case, let's read through some of this story, and I will pass the microphone to someone who can read. We're going to read through the first page and go from there.
We learned elsewhere, if he cuts into separate tiles, placing sand between each tile, Rabbi Eliezer declares it pure, and the sages declare it impure. And this was the Oven of Aknai. Why the Oven of Aknai? Said Rav Judah in Samuel's name, it means that they surrounded him with arguments as a snake and proved it impure. It has been taught, on that day, Rabbi Eliezer brought forward every imaginable argument, but they did not accept them. Said he to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let this carob tree prove it. Thereupon the carob tree was torn 100 cubits out of its place. Others affirm 400 cubits. No proof can be brought from a carob tree, they retorted. Again he said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let the stream of water prove it. Whereupon the stream of water flowed backwards. No proof can be brought from a stream of water, they rejoined. Again he urged, if the halacha agrees with me, let the walls of the Beit Midrash prove it. Whereupon the walls inclined to fall. Rabbi Joshua chastised them, saying, "When the scholars defeat each other in law, what is it for you?" They did not fall because of the honor of Rabbi Joshua, and they did not stand because of the honor of Rabbi Eliezer, and they are still standing thus inclined.
Let's just stop there for a second. If this is a story that is asking kind of the deepest questions about that authority and autonomy versus heteronomy, who owns the Torah? Who has the ability or the right to interpret the text? And in many ways, it's a question that Talmudists or legalists are involved in, but it's also, I think, a question that we're involved in our communities constantly. Do we own the pieces of culture, the pieces of identity that we have? Are we allowed, how much are we allowed to change or shape? How much are we empowered to redefine the spaces here? Here's a text that is asking this very question. And it's asking it through a very simple, through the most mundane conversation. A conversation about an oven that is impure. But it's called the oven of the snake. Now let's just start there, because the way we're going to read this is also through a little bit of a literary reading. Why is this called the oven of the snake? What's the snake about? On a basic level, this is usually understood as this oven, this poor Nebuch oven, this blip in Talmudic law that no one cares about. We ended talking about it so much that we surrounded it like a snake, right? So we've talked so much about this oven, we've strangled the oven. No one knows today anymore what this oven is. The laws of purity, look, we just skipped over it. No one even asked, what's this oven really about? We don't care about the oven anymore. We care about the snake, the words that we've encircled around it. But there's also another level here, a hint, which is that Rabbi Akiva is being encircled in words like a snake. And this is worth remembering for later on, because when does a snake encircle something?
It's about to strangle
in order to kill it, in order to strangle it. So there's actually something going on here already that feels this isn't just any conversation. And if we think at least that this Talmudic story is on the side of, as you remember this, who wins this argument in the Talmud? Does Rabbi Eliezer win this argument? No. Rabbi Yeshua does, or Rabban Gamliel, or one of the other characters, right? The fact, those who say it's not in heaven are the ones who win. And yet the story starts by saying there was a snake here and there was prey. And perhaps Rabbi Eliezer is the prey, and the snake is everyone else. So we're going to have to go back to that later on. So as the story plays out, and again, I'm kind of skimming this because I think because for many of us this is a well-known story, and if not, you get it pretty quickly, right? Rabbi Eliezer is saying one thing, the rabbis are saying something else, and at some point, the rational conversation gets to a stop. At some point, he gives them all the rational arguments he can, and he's unable to convince them. And at the end of the day, it's going to be whatever it is, 17-1, or 99-1, or 3-1. It doesn't really matter, right? Rabbi Eliezer is not able to move the majority in his favor. And that's when he starts pulling the tricks out of his hat. And he starts performing miracles, or tricks, right? We're not really sure what they are. But in any case, he starts leaving the rational conversation and turning to calling a higher authority. And you sort of see the competition developing here between our ability to sit in a room and discuss something rationally and convince people, which is the Talmudic rules of engagement. Rabbi Eliezer says, well, that's not the only Talmudic rules of engagement. Rationality and logic and human interpretation is not the only player here. There's another player here, and that is the will of God, miracles. And the rabbis quickly block him. They prevent him. They're saying, we don't prove it that way. But they don't immediately say, lo b'shamayim, right? They try to avoid it. And here's my question to you. Why don't they just immediately say, lo b'shamayim? Why do we need to go through the carob and the water and the walls? Why doesn't Rabbi Yeshua from the beginning say, hey, no miracles, it's not in heaven? But rather they say, oh, we don't prove from a carob tree, or we don't prove from water, or, students are arguing, why are you getting involved? When they are forced to end up saying it's not in heaven, it's actually a painful statement, right? Or it's almost like, when you're serving your grandmother's chicken soup and everyone's enjoying the soup, and then they start asking all these questions, and you end up saying, yeah, you know what, it actually isn't my grandmother's recipe. I actually downloaded it from the internet last night. But I'd rather not say that. There's an aspect where you would then say, it's a farce, it's a lie, right? Why are you calling it, or you just call whatever you want your grandmother's soup. But there's an aspect where they don't want to pull that out. They don't want to have to say it. And I think that's one of the most curious moments there, and it's unsolved for me at least. Why they're reticent. And I think later on they're angry at Rabbi Eliezer for putting them in the position to have had to say that. You want to say in the back, Karen?
I just was going to say that maybe there was something about the threes too, just like we're supposed to turn away a person 3 times if they want to convert. That maybe these were like 3 proofs.
Nice. So there's like it was a process of 1, 2, 3, and only then. You could also say that there's an aspect of he's sort of slowly getting closer and closer to home. He starts from something distant like this tree, then it's the water, the ability to sort of totally reverse the order of nature, and then finally the walls of the Beit Midrash. What's the symbolism of the walls of the Beit Midrash falling down?
The whole system falls apart.
Exactly. Rabbi Eliezer in a way is saying, look guys, if you're not in line, if your decisions are not in line with divine truth, then the whole project, which is the Beit Midrash, crashes down. These walls are only held up because divine will at every single moment allows them to, and because everything we rule here will end up being according to divine rule. That's Rabbi Eliezer's Beit Midrash. What's Rabbi Yeshua's Beit Midrash? What holds the walls up? Not the fact that God agrees with every moment, right? But simply, I think, the fact that human beings built those walls. Or perhaps that they built those walls in order to create a place to discuss God's rules. What's interesting is the walls don't go straight up. They stay tilted. And that again, I think, reminds me that it's not about either this is divine word or it's human word, but rather there's a tension between the divine word and the human word. That tension is unsolved. That tension is also actually necessary for the project. Let's go back to this and read the next 3 comments.
Again he said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let it be proved from heaven. Whereupon a heavenly voice cried out, why do you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer, seeing that in all matters the halacha agrees with him? Rabbi Yeshua stood up on his feet and exclaimed, it is not in heaven. What did he mean by this? Said Reb Jeremiah, that the Torah had already been given at Mount Sinai. We pay no attention to a heavenly voice, because thou hast long since written in the Torah at Mount Sinai, after the majority must one incline. Rab Nathan met Elijah and asked him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do in that hour? He laughed with joy and said, my sons have defeated me, my sons have defeated me.
3 very powerful statements here. One is Rabbi Yeshua standing up and saying it's not in heaven. Second of all, I should say before that, this voice from heaven coming out and saying, why do don't you understand that Rabbi Eliezer is always right? And this ability of a voice from heaven, whatever that means, right? Interestingly, the Hebrew term for bat kol doesn't actually mean a voice from heaven like from a megaphone. It actually means an echo. What in modern Hebrew you'd call hed, an echo. So it's more of a distant sound in a way. I don't know what that sounds like. But Rabbi Yeshua says, why do we dispute Rabbi Eliezer? Because the discussion is down here. It's not up there. And when Rabbi Yirmiyah explains what Rabbi Yeshua means, he says, Sinai was a paradigm shift. Something happened at Sinai that changed things forever. And I think that this brings us sort of back to one of the basic questions of David Hartman's theology or understanding. You may have already heard this today in the different discussions, or maybe not, right? But Sinai meant something different from everything that came before it. And I think almost every modern Jewish thinker is trying to figure out what did Sinai mean. But one of the things that makes David Hartman so relevant today is that for him, Sinai, which happened, 3,000 years ago, and we're about to celebrate in Shavuot, means what it means the same thing that we need it to mean today. Sinai is, so what is Sinai about for David Hartman? In the most simple way, right? Sinai is about the moment where God understands that he doesn't want to be in a monologue. He wants to be in a dialogue. And in fact, more than that, he wants to empower human beings. He wants to empower human beings to take control of the narrative. And the way he would play it out is the following. David Hartman would tell a story about how once when he was a rabbi in Montreal, one of his young congregants came to him and said, I would be observant, I would be halachic, if God would just perform one miracle for me. If God would just, stop this clock for just a second, I would immediately accept all mitzvot. And David Hartman responded saying, actually, you probably wouldn't. The truth is, miracles aren't what human beings want to justify a practice. That is not what's going to change you. And you know who the first person who made that mistake was? God himself. The way David Hartman read the book of Genesis and Exodus is God figuring out the hard way that miracles don't change people. They might change them for about 5 minutes or 3 weeks, but not in the long run. If you think about it, right, God creates these miracles for Adam and Eve and then gives them the law, and what do? They break the law. He creates a miracle for Noah, right? And what do people do afterwards? They break the law. He creates a miracle for the Israelites getting out of Egypt. 1 miracle, 10 miracles, 50 miracles. None of them change them. Miracles is not what changes people's behavior. What does instead? Now that's a hard lesson for God. It takes him a long time to figure that out. But once he does, quote unquote, figure that out, he changes course. He says, if miracles aren't what's going to change people, what will change them? And that's where Sinai comes in. Sinai is the place where he says, I'm not going to try and communicate to you through miracles and then law. I'm going to empower you to take control of the law. I'm going to give the law to you, and from now on you have the responsibility to be to take this on, to take this forward. In other words, God realizes that as a miracle man, he's not going to be able to change human beings. Rather, as a teacher, he's going to be able to change human beings, and creating a dynasty of teachers. And that, in a way, is perhaps the biggest takeaway of the first Mishnah of Pirkei Avot. Right? God gave Torah to Moses, and Moses gave it to Joshua, and Joshua gave it to the elders, and the elders gave it to the prophets, and so on and so forth, or maybe the opposite, the prophets gave it to the elders. Doesn't really matter. People usually read that Mishnah as, that means the tradition is unbroken. The divine truth of Sinai has continued from generation to generation, and our job is to be custodians of that divine truth, which has never changed for 3,000 years. David Hartman would say, that's the biggest amount of BS I've ever heard. That's not what this Mishnah is teaching us. What that Mishnah is teaching us is God created a student. His student was Moses. Moses created a student. His student was Joshua. Joshua created students. His students were the prophets. The prophets had the elders. The elders had the sages. Teachers who created students, who created students, who created students. And whenever students receive something from a teacher, they receive it creatively. They receive it on their own terms, but they feel as if they are continuing, and they truly are continuing that which the teacher wanted. In this story that we're reading, Rabbi Eliezer, the miracle man, is standing vis-a-vis Rabbi Yehoshua, the teacher. And just as God had to learn that the way to be in the world, the way to really affect human beings is to stop being a miracle man and become a teacher, so Rabbi Eliezer has to learn that he can't just be miracle man. Sure, he can channel whatever, that part of God, right? You can try to pull off miracles, and that might work for some people or for certain times. But really what the whole Talmudic project is about God stopping to become a miracle person and becoming a teacher in that way. Yeah.
The problem with a charismatic leader or a charismatic teacher, that often we seek out teachers who are inspiring and charismatic, and you get a real hit after you've participated in the class with them, but that's not self-sustaining. I mean, you're so dependent upon their inspiration, their miracle.
So you're sort of gliding on their energy, but instead of being
their energy, you're not. And that's not a creative process. That's almost like you're leeching off of a parasitic process of leeching off a teacher's charisma. And I think when we think about building a Beit Midrash, we think about what sort of teacher we want to seek out, or what sort of teacher somebody wants to be, departing from to make sure that it's not about tricks. It's not about influencing somebody's emotions, but rather to engage in a truly creative and empowering process for that student, so that they can walk away and
right. And when David speaks about the fact that God chooses to become a teacher, it's not a narrative of human beings are so great, we're so wonderful, we're so smart, God can give us the authority. But rather, human beings are actually pretty weak. Human beings are unable to just receive the law and perform it. The only way to cultivate a real community is through learning and empowering. And therefore, it's not just about, oh, we're so great, lo b'shamayim hi, God believes in human beings and human beings can decide whatever they want. It's not that God simply wants the place of sort of personal autonomy. That's actually not, that would work well for other modern Jewish thinkers. That's not what David Hartman is saying. He's actually saying it from a place of recognizing deep human fragility and deep human stubbornness, and realizing that the only way to deal with that stubbornness is through really creating communities of teachers and students in that way. And I think at the end of the day, you might draw the line of what makes him. Actually, see, we're almost out of time. I wanna end with 3 comments on my end. I'm curious to hear if you have your own. One is I think throughout my own childhood and years at the Hartman Institute, there was always the question. In Israel, it's more acute, but it was also here in America, which is, who orthodoxy? Is he Orthodox? Luckily, I think one of the bravest things about David Hartman was he didn't concern himself with that question. But if there was a way in which David Hartman continued to be highly relevant throughout the Jewish spectrum, and the place where I would say closest to what other people might call orthodox, is that the source of authority did not rely in human autonomy. It wasn't about, I'm going to empower you so that you can make bold decisions about your own life by yourself because I believe that you are an autonomous human being. Rather, it was very much about continually being linked to the community that also stood at Sinai, and realizing that the only way we can achieve truth is through that relationship with the community. And so at the end of the day, the arbiter of decisions, what is right and what is wrong, is not the individual human being, but it's also not God. It's what at the end of the day will play out in the community. Now that doesn't mean you can't innovate. It doesn't mean you're constantly shackled now by what the neighbors might say or what people will say of you. No, it means you have to create, you're led to create the innovative creativity that you want to see as a real student, as a bona fide, authentic student of the tradition. But if it's going to end up being a good decision is whether the community will follow you. And that's at the end of the day the test of it. It also means that at times you need to have, as we're trying to figure out when we're, as students of our teachers, when do we embrace patience and when do we embrace impatience? A lot of it depends on where the community is at and who the community that you're trying to work with. And that's going to decide how you're going to act in the world. In that way, I think having the sense that Judaism is not just about empowering a series of individuals, but is about being deeply attuned to the community, I think that he was channeling a lot of the sort of intuitions that we often see in the Orthodox community. At the same time, it was exactly that intuition of saying, where is the community and where do we need to lead, that David Hartman saw, and that made him want to break out Torah to so many places, because he saw where the community was at. He saw where people were going in that way. I want to end with one story, which is that David Hartman would, in the Beit Midrash that he created, as we said before, it was created out of a sense of there is not just one path to truth, but there are many paths to truth. That Judaism is a path to truth, or Sinai is a path to truth, but there are other bona fide paths to truth, and whether that's what he discovered on the basketball court, as we described before, or what he saw in the fact that you can lead a full secular life and be an ethical human being. He would say how often a lot of that he owes to his teacher, Rabbi Soloveitchik, who sent him to go study at Fordham, a Jesuit university, study philosophy there. And he says how as a young yeshiva student, he asked Rabbi Soloveitchik, but isn't it dangerous if I go study with the Jesuits? Wouldn't it be better if I studied philosophy here at YU? And Rabbi Soloveitchik said, look, I live in Boston, and I fly 3 times a week to New York to teach my Talmud class here at YU. Is it dangerous to fly? Yes. Do I do it anyway because that is the right thing to do, because that is the place that will serve the community or teach Torah or whatever it is? Absolutely. So you too need to do this, and even if it's dangerous, it's the right thing to do. And David Hartman would say that 3 years later, he sent a letter to his teacher. He said, Rebbe, my plane crashed. There was an aspect where he studied, and the big crisis did happen. He broke out of yeshiva world. I would say that thank God that plane crashed. It crashed and created an enormous amount of creativity from it. So I think that story, and also in many ways, and I think a lot of what the Hartman Beit Midrash was often about is that something that might seem as a plane crash at the time ends up being the most creative thing. Just like what might seem as the biggest divergence from Moses' Torah ends up being exactly the fulfillment of Moses' Torah, or that what you think might not be in heaven might actually be what's making God smile. Thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.